how can we target the rotator cuff in yoga? Well, first of all, let's just define what the rotator cuff is in case we were wondering at all. The rotator cuff is a group of four smallish muscles in the shoulder joint, and they run from our scapula or our shoulder blade to the head of our humerus or our upper arm bone. And these four muscles and their tendons, they collectively form what's called a cuff around the shoulder joint. So the rotator cuffs and the muscles and tendons form this cuff around the joint, and that cuff serves to protect and stabilize the shoulder joint. So now we understand that the rotator cuff muscles perform two main functions in the body. They move the shoulder joint and they also stabilize the shoulder joint. So that means that if we're interested in targeting the rotator cuff, we can do that in one of two broad ways. We can target the rotator cuff in its movement function, and or we could target the rotator cuff in its stabilizing function. So in a few moments, we are going to talk about targeting the rotator cuff in terms of movement, like how it moves. But for right now, let's turn our attention to the rotator cuff and its stabilizing role and how we might think about targeting it that way. Because in my opinion, this is maybe a little more interesting and potentially more eye-opening depending on what you've learned or been taught about the rotator cuff before. But basically, here's the deal. We know, and we have research that's like looked specifically at this and has definitively suggested or definitively told us that our rotator cuff muscles work in their stabilizing role anytime that we move our arms around. So basically anything we do with our arms, our rotator cuff muscles are also working. They're always working when we use our arms. So that means that just a ton, really all the ways that we use our arms in like say our yoga practice. We do a lot of like arm weight bearing in yoga, and like in the strength world with our strength exercises, basically any upper body loading and strength exercise, even if we don't tend to think about it as a rotator cuff exercise, it is a rotator cuff exercise in addition to also being like an exercise for all the other muscles we traditionally tend to think of. So let's say, for example, we don't tend to think of a push-up or chaturanga. We don't tend to think of this movement as a rotator cuff exercise. If anything, maybe we or I tend to think of it as like a horizontal pushing strength movement. In terms of muscles, we tend to think it's triceps, it's pectoralis, it's anterior deltoid, and it is. But in addition to all that, it's also the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is also working when we do like horizontal push and anything with our arms. The rotator cuff is also working when we do something like a classic row, like this type of exercise. Again, we tend to think of this as like biceps, maybe latch. This is a horizontal pulling exercise, and it is, but it's also a rotator cuff exercise because anytime that we move our arms, we are also using the rotator cuff. And then the more load that we use, like, it's one thing to, I don't know, say I just did this with nothing, here my rotator cuff muscles, they'll certainly work, as will the other muscles that would perform this movement against gravity. But when I actually add more load, then I'm holding a weight and then my muscles work harder. That means I'm also loading the rotator cuff muscles harder. So there's much more potential for these muscles to actually strengthen when we add load to our movements. So I think that's a really good thing to realize about the rotator cuff muscles because it helps us see that it's not necessarily as complicated or specific as we may have thought when it comes to targeting the rotator cuff muscles. There are not like special specific exercises and movements that must be done when we want to target the rotator cuff. It's not like this limited, narrow selection we have. It's actually any time that we use and move our arms, all of that will target the rotator cuff. So I think that's really like freeing and helps give us like just a lot more options if we're really interested in targeting the rotator cuff. So I think this is a really good insight to take with us. But I would like to point out for our movement geeky minds that research has actually suggested to us that there's a little more specificity there. And if we're interested, and I think that we are because we are movement geeky people, I think this is also helpful and informative to know about. So it turns out that some research that's looked at muscle activation in different tasks has told us that when we perform movements that are shoulder flexion based, so lifting the arm up overhead, that this will, of course, this will use all of the rotator cuff muscles, but it will preferentially use and like activate more the infraspinatus, so that muscle in the back, and the supraspinatus, the one on the top. So shoulder flexion movements will preferentially use those two of the four rotator cuff muscles, supraspinatus and infraspinatus. And so that means, like if we're thinking a yoga context, I mean, that's anytime our arms are up, but especially like think downward facing dog, because we've got a little more load because we're weight bearing, or handstand, or chaturanga, which I showed a little earlier as an example. This is also a shoulder flexion exercise. Even though the arms don't go up, we're still flexing the shoulders. So all of those in yoga that we have in our hands will target the rotator cuff, but more specifically, they'll target infraspinatus and supraspinatus. Then on the flip side, we know from research that movements that involve shoulder extension or bringing the arms back by our side, these will preferentially target the subscapularis, which is that muscle on the inside, the front side of the scapula. So subscapularis is preferentially targeted when we perform shoulder extension. So in a yoga context, we might think of that as something like Purvottanasana. This is a great shoulder extension movement, or reverse table, which is a bit of a, you could think of that as a regression from Purvottanasana. So like movements like that load the shoulders in extension will preferentially target subscapularis. And finally, we also know from research that movements that involve abduction, so taking the arms out and up like this, these movements, this is super cool, they actually involve all of the muscles of not only the rotator cuff, but basically the whole shoulder. All the muscles of the shoulder and all four rotator cuff muscles are all targeted when we do shoulder abduction movements. So if we wanted to think in terms of like strength training, then something like this movement, which is called a lateral raise, would be a great way to fire up all the muscles of the shoulder, but to specifically target all of the rotator cuff muscles because they all tend to work pretty equally in abduction. And if that's a strength exercise example, one yoga-based example that we have of like loading the upper arm in abduction is side plank. So side plank Vasisthasana, this pose, is a really great way to target the entire rotator cuff and everything else around the shoulder. But specifically, since this video, we're thinking about the rotator cuff, that's a really good way to target the entire rotator cuff. So isn't that cool? So we can get a little more specific if we want to, maybe we want to, or maybe this is just informative, like in a movement geeky sense to understand these preferential differences in our arm movements. But basically that kind of summarizes what research has suggested about the rotator cuff. And again, all of this that we just talked about was all the rotator cuff in its stabilizing role. So let's turn our attention now to targeting the rotator cuff in its movement role. One of the most straightforward ways to rotationally target the rotator cuff is to do this movement. And I think it's very likely that you've seen or done this before, but this is palms up external rotation. And we could do it like both arms at the same time, like I'm about to show, but you can also do a setup where you just do one arm at a time. But here I'm holding a resistance band. I hug my elbows in and then I pull apart on the band and slowly bring my hands back in. So I know that in a yoga context, we don't tend to have resistance bands. I'm just showing this because I think this is helpful for our movement understanding. So the band has resistance. It's trying to pull inward and we are having to pull out on the band, and therefore our external rotators, so the muscles of the rotator cuff that externally rotate, infraspinatus spinatus and teres minor, they are forced to work against resistance in this movement. They have to pull against the resistance of the band in order to pull my hands wide, and that is targeting them in their external rotation function. So this is great to do. And then, like I said, in yoga, we don't tend to have resistance bands. So you can actually swap out and use a yoga strap instead of a resistance band. And then in this case, it would just be an isometric. We would not be dynamically pulling because a strap doesn't lengthen as you pull on it. It's just taut. So we would just hold here and then pull apart, and you could pull apart with quite a bit of force to actually really load up those external rotators. So this would be like a yoga prop version of palms up external rotation, and it would be isometric instead of dynamic. And then let's look quickly at the idea of targeting the external rotators, like by holding something like a hand weight. And I know this is a little more like in the gym or the fitness setting, but I know that sometimes in the yoga studio, sometimes we do have little dumbbells. Certain classes use them. So this may be relevant for that. So let's look at, this is something we very commonly see out there that people often think is targeting the external rotators, but is actually not. And it looks like this. You hold the dumbbell, and you could do this with two at the same time or just one. Hold the dumbbell here and then take it wide. So this is commonly believed to be an external rotator targeter, but it's actually not, because here's the deal. Where is the resistance in this movement? Like what's actually working against these muscles that are trying to, that are moving the arm into rotation? When I was holding the resistance band, then the resistance was in the band, and it was this like horizontal resistance, and I had to pull against it. That was good. That was targeting the external rotators. But if I hold a dumbbell here or a weight plate or any like weight, and I do this, where's the, like, what direction is the resistance coming from as far as these rotators go? There really is not resistance that they're having to work against, because the dumbbell is, this is our weight here, this is our resistance, and it's not working horizontally. I know we move it horizontally, but the resistance is actually pulling down, because gravity is a force that pulls down. So it's this downward action that is, downward force that is acting on the weight that wants to pull down. So where the resistance mainly is in this movement is not really on external rotation, it's on elbow flexion. And it's that my elbow flexor muscles, including like the biceps, the brachialis, these muscles are the ones that are actually working here in order to hold the weight at this like 90-degree angle. So it's really, we can kind of loosely say this is like an isometric work for the biceps as I take the arm in and out of internal and external rotation. So the work is really more in the elbow flexors, and it's not so much in the external rotators. So word to the wise that if that's your goal, that doing this is not really going to, like if your goal is to load the external rotators, this is not a good way to do that. But if you did want to use a weight, and again, this is something we could potentially do in yoga if we have like these weights with us, you can do a side lying version where you lie on your side, and now I hold the dumbbell here and I lift it up against gravity. Remember, gravity is acting down. So in this orientation to gravity, I do have to lift this up against gravity, and I do that from my external rotators. So hopefully your movement eyes can see that if I want to target the external rotators holding a weight, this orientation of gravity would be the correct one to achieve my goal. This is actually going to fire infraspinatus and teres minor up, but this is not really going to, and if anything, it's just firing up, and not very much because this is not a very heavy weight, but if anything is fired up, it's mostly just the biceps working against that resistance. So those were kind of some classic ways that we might think of targeting the rotator cuff in its rotational role, in its external rotational role, I should say. But I have two others to show that we can do in a yoga context that will also target external rotation, and they might not be like as common or as intuitive. So here is one of them. Here we can lie face down or prone and bring our arms into goalpost arms. And then you could have your head all the way down. I just have mine up because I'm talking to you here. But from here, you can lift your arms up off the floor or your hands up off the floor, keeping the elbows down and then lower. And you could do that with body weight, or you could hold dumbbells, one in each hand, and then lift here. So this would not be a great arc of range of motion. It's like a smaller range of motion, but it is an effective way to light up the external rotators. And we could do that just simple as is, or you could sort of combine doing that kind of work with Shalabhasana, which is like our locust pose in yoga. And we often do that from a face down position. So you could kind of weave maybe just some external rotation specific focused things, then maybe lift up into Shalabhasana, or maybe do external rotation work and then like bring your elbows in, come into Sphinx or Cobra, like just all these ideas of movements that we often do in this prone position that involve the arms, but we could throw in that specific external rotation. And then another one is this movement that we do at the wall, and this is called wall angels, and you may have seen or done this before. But wall angels look like this. You stand against the wall, bring your arms into goalpost arms, and then we try to keep our elbows and our hands on the wall as we slide up and then lower down. So the deal here is that as we slide up, we kind of want to come out, like bring our hands away from the wall, and that would be, internally rotating. But instead we resist that by committing to the hands staying on. So as we lift up, it gets harder and our external rotators have to work more to keep our hands pressed into the wall. And if you lift so high that you cannot keep the hands on the wall, then that would be too high just for the purposes of this movement. Here we would want to just go up and down within that range that we can keep the hands on the wall. So that's a really great way to target external rotation. And of course, that's a movement that also targets, other biomechanical aspects in the body, like thoracic extension and just the posterior shoulder in general. But it's also specific to external rotation. Okay, so all of those rotational movements for the rotator cuff that we just talked about were all external rotation. So there is a whole other side to the rotation of the shoulder, and that's internal rotation. So what about that? Well, it turns out that really effectively targeting internal rotation, and especially in a yoga context, is not super practical or easy to do in this kind of context. If you were like in a gym, you could do something with a cable machine and you could pull on a cable like against resistance this way. If it were pulling you this way, that would target internal rotation. But that's not what we have on our hands like in a yoga setting. But if you did happen to be in a context where you had a weight, there is a side line. So remember a moment ago I showed this external rotation side line, which was good. So in this one, this would actually target internal rotation, but now I use the bottom arm and then I lift up and I lower down. It's not the best that there is for like thoroughly targeting internal rotation, but it's something. And as you can see, because I am against resistance, the weight is trying to push me down. I'm moving against that resistance into internal rotation. So this is kind of really the one thing that's available for us in a yoga context, if we even have weights like this, would be something like that. But in general, when people talk and think about and like prescribe or assign rotator cuff exercises, they tend to be more the external rotation, but there are, some specific ways that we can target internal rotation too. Here's our final section on how to target the rotator cuff muscles in terms of rotation. So we just talked about targeting the rotators in terms of loading them and asking them to work against resistance. And all of that is really good stuff. But there's another way that we could think of targeting the rotators, which is to just mobilize them through like their full range of motion in rotation. And I really like this approach. This is something that's like extra intuitive in a yoga context. We tend to do a lot of mobilizing in yoga, and we can do that for the shoulders. So in this, again, this wouldn't be so much about loading the rotator muscles, but more about mobilizing them and through a full range of motion. So one way to just kind of simply do that is just to stand. And I like to make fists here. We don't have to. You could also reach through your fingers, but I like to do something where the hands are active and we reach down through them, because that helps create tension through the arms. And then that helps just isolate the movement that we're after just to the shoulder. So here in this kind of simple movement, I'm holding my arms firm and I'm rotating them. I'm spinning them into internal rotation and external rotation. I'm trying not to move anything else in my body, and I'm just trying to internally and externally rotate. So that is a nice, simple, and active mobilization for the rotator cuff muscles. We can do it like in a standing position. We could do it with our arms wide. In yoga, we could do it like here in Warrior Two pose, or I mean, we could do it anywhere really, and we could get creative in our poses. Maybe we're in high lunge, and then we internally and externally rotate here. In downward facing dog, maybe when we're bearing more load, we think of internally and externally rotating. So just anything that gets the shoulders moving through this full, specifically rotational range of motion. And then a final way that I sometimes like to do this is we can lie on our back, take our arms into goalpost arms, or maybe this is like scarecrow arms here. And then we can bring the backs of our hands to the floor. So this is goalpost, and this is external rotation. Then we lift back up, we come through the starting position, then we keep going down, bringing the palms toward the floor. For most people, they may not actually get to the floor. This is internal rotation. And then we can go back and forth here, again, trying to keep everything else from moving, and trying to keep our shoulder blades pretty just grounded where they are. So we're not letting the shoulder blades move, so that we can just move our upper arm bones and mobilize the rotator cuff. And really, we're mobilizing the rotator cuff, but also other muscles in the shoulder as well that would be lengthening as we move into rotation. But with that, those are all of my ideas for targeting the rotator cuff, both specific and kind of small, and grander and bigger and a little simpler. So I hope that you appreciated this content and you found it informative and helpful. And if you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on all of the tips that I share.